I don't think the pcfx is going to be a system that will ever be like the next big hit thing that, everybody's talking about when it comes to retro games. But I think we are on the cusp of the pcfx being a system that can be better appreciated as we have more and more people understanding the Japanese market, more and more people like you translating these games that give us the ideas behind these games, where they came from, and providing a better understanding for kind of the normal player. Hello and welcome to the PCFX Fan Club podcast. This is a new podcast that's about expanding the English-speaking retro game community's understanding of NEC's PC engine successor, the pcfx. My name's Benjamin Yoder, and I'm one of your co-hosts here today. I've previously done some work on some English guides for the PCFX, as well as some previous PCFX podcasts. And thankfully, for this journey here of this new podcast, I'll be joined along with my co-host here, Matt. You want to introduce yourself real quick, Matt?
Sure. I'm Matt LaFrance. I am a video game collector and a big PCFX fan. I have also done some unofficial fan translation work, specifically on a PCFX game called Welcome to pcfx. So I'm very pleased to be joining Ben today on this podcast.
Yeah, and I think we both are two people who have had a long-running passion for the PCFX, or at least a passion for at least like 5 years. I feel like at the very least, definitely longer for you, Matt. I think we mentioned before in a previous podcast that we were on together that you were somebody who was a part of the fan base initially when the system came out back in the 90s, right?
Yes. No, I was actually, honored to, be able to have played the system when it was contemporary.
Yeah. So I think there's going to be some really fun things that we're going to be exploring here. But for this first pilot episode, we want to do a handful of different things. One is to just give a quick introduction of the PCFX. We don't want to spend way too much time on this because there are a lot of introductory resources to the PCFX out there, not only in terms of the podcast that we've done in the past, but also in terms of other creators out there who have made content. And we'll go a little more detail about what we think or what some resources are for that. If you want to explore that further beyond what we introduce here. We're also going to do a little bit of an introduction of ourselves and how we got into the PCFX platform and what we think is really draws us into the PCFX. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the modern appeal of the system too. With retro games being as big as they are today, what does the PCFX offer in terms of an insight into what was happening in the game industry at that time, and what does that do for a player today if they decide to revisit the system. And then finally, I think we'll also talk a little bit about what we plan to explore on the podcast as a whole, and then also talk about some of the resources that will be surrounding the podcast as well. So to get started though on the actual PCFX itself, a quick little introduction. Matt, do you want to give a brief rundown of the PCFX system?
Yeah. I guess, technically, depending on where you look, I suppose the PCFX is kind of an extension of the PC98 line of PCs that NEC was, producing at the time. As a home console, it is also, something of a successor to the PC Engine, which, listeners to this podcast may or may not be familiar with. It was released, in the West as the Turbo-Graphx 16. It didn't exactly, light the gaming world on fire outside of Japan, unfortunately, but it was actually quite successful in Japan, mostly as a competitor directly to the Nintendo Famicom. It did have a CD add-on, and the PCFX, I believe it was released in December of 1984. Does that sound right?
Yeah, the PCFX. Yeah.
Yeah. So late in 94, it's a 5th gen system. So technically it was competing directly with the PlayStation, Saturn, 3DO, that kind of thing, right in that kind of CD-ROM multimedia, boom of systems, so to speak. And it had what, maybe a 5-year lifespan, 5 or 6 years, something like that. There were about a little over 60 games released for it. And it's a super interesting kind of CD-ROM based system. It does have some integration with the PC-98 PCs, but it's generally considered like a commercial failure. And it was also the last home console system that NEC developed.
Yeah, and the system, compared to a lot of the other systems out there, has like a highly specific use case in a lot of ways. Obviously, with hardware, you can kind of do different things with it, but the real draw of it was basically full motion video being a big part of it, as well as like high quality 2D sprite work, and some games kind of meshing those two things together as well. But probably more importantly was the types of games coming out on the system, because they had a very Japanese audience focus. So when you look at like the PC Engine and the games that were successful on it in Japan, some of those games are pretty different than what we view as like, what are, the great hits of the PC Engine here in the West, just due to accessibility and what got localized and things like that. And a lot of the library of the pcfx leans a lot more towards what Matt mentioned on the PC-98, which is basically a line of Japanese home computers. At the time, home computers were a bit more regionalized, so you wouldn't have like a PC-98 brand here in the West. As far as I understand, it's more or less a region-locked PC for all intents and purposes. And so
Yeah.
the games, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, Japan actually had a pretty interesting, like, PC culture at the time. It's where you get things like the MSX, which is kind of a Japanese only PC system that was actually released by Microsoft. So they were kind of like competing like with themselves in Japan, against like, Windows machines and things like that. It took a while for sort of Windows to sort of become the de facto standard, sort of the way that it did, in the West. So you had things like the, Fujitsu, like the FM Towns and the PC-98, and there's something I'm forgetting, but there were some really interesting things going on in the Japanese, PC gaming space at that time as well.
Yeah, and so the Japanese market in general for games, I think, outside of probably the major hits that we're aware of, and the platforms like the Super Nintendo and things like that, where there were these games that kind of extended overseas. Platforms like the PC-98 and the pcfx and to some extent parts of the PC Engine library, given the fact that Turbo-Graphx wasn't doing super well, feel a lot more reflective of, I think, the Japanese market as a whole and Japanese culture. And so you end up with a lot of anime focused kind of games on the pcfx specifically, or at least games that are kind of inspired by a lot of more anime elements, I feel like, on platforms like the PC Engine and the PC-98, and valuing the highly detailed art and things like that, and like the full screen cutscenes at times, or not full screen, but these kind of like high quality sprite art cutscenes that would happen on platforms like the PC Engine, which does exist on like the Nintendo platforms and things like that as well. But it just feels like a lot more of a focus on these other platforms.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just the PCFX, maybe more so than any of the other 5th gen systems, I feel like was really just taking a direct line from like what was happening on its sort of previous iteration in terms of the PC Engine CD. So you actually see some sort of sequels to games that were coming out on the PC Engine CD. But you definitely like the CD systems. I think the Mega CD and the PC Engine CD, what they could bring to the table was types of full motion video, right? But they were very limited. I had a, Sega CD back in the day. I don't know if you remember, but we tend to look back with these nostalgia tinted glasses and forget that all of the video happening in those things were very low color. They were very low resolution. They were in small boxes and things like that. So, I think you see on the PCFX, really like kind of the RPGs and the simulation games and adventure games and things like that were popular on PC-98 PCs and on the PC Engine CD. You could have them with better sound, more colors, better quality video, things like that. I think that that's kind of where the pcfx was really going. It's not really where the 5th gen consoles as a whole went.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the focus of that system, I think.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that, like, when we look at the 5th gen consoles, obviously in hindsight, the big ones are, Nintendo 64, the PlayStation, 5th gen, right? Am I thinking right on that?
I think so.
Yeah.
Because the N64 was like later in the gen, but it was a direct competitor to the PlayStation and the Saturn and things like that. I mean,
yeah. So you have the Saturn, the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, which are the big ones. But this is kind of like a really crazy time in the game industry as a whole, where a lot of different people who weren't really game companies were getting in. Like you have Panasonic coming in and working with 3DO to make the 3DO system. I think you mentioned that a little bit earlier. But then you also had like Nintendo doing the Virtual Boy, right? And Sega doing a bunch of virtual reality stuff in arcades. And then you still had the older, previous gen consoles still, around and thriving and really focusing on 2D games on those platforms. And like all these platforms were doing different things and pursuing different technologies. And this really kind of like, I guess you could say, arms race of different types of formats of people just trying to figure out what's the next big thing after, 2D graphics and maybe to some extent, just further pursuing, how we do 2D games with things like the Sega Saturn kind of initially being designed as a 2D powerhouse machine, right? Over something like that.
It was very Wild West. And I think that's, it's maybe easy to miss why that was the case, looking back now. But it's interesting you mentioned the Virtual Boy, because I believe the Virtual Boy actually uses the same CPU that the pcfx does. Yes.
I didn't know that. Yeah. So yeah, but it is a really interesting time in the game industry as a whole. But yeah, it is this very Japanese focused system, and it had Japanese fans only in mind. I don't know if there ever was any intentions to localize the pcfx. It only released in Japan.
It seems like the Turbo-Graphx, did so poorly overseas. I can't imagine NEC, thought that there was any point in doing that.
Yeah. So I think most people in the West largely were probably introduced to this console after the fact. Obviously, you're kind of an exception. I would imagine people who were the hardcore PC or Turbo-Graphx fans at the time probably had some awareness of it to some degree. And I definitely saw like a lot of mentions of it. And like when you look at that really early press around that 5th generation, the pcfx does come up just, I think, by, on the coattails of the PC or the Turbo-Graphx being something, right? And in the West and existing to some degree. But you really only have, I think, a very small group of people who are looking at the pcfx initially. And the understanding about, I think, the Japanese game market at the time was significantly different. I don't think you had people really looking deeply into like what games were super popular in Japan and what was succeeding in Japan and why it was succeeding, things like that, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's just like this weird mist around it. Mm-hmm. I could be wrong. Is this still around the time where there is just kind of like a general mystery about Japan to some extent? Like I know around that time you have some countries where it feels like in America we had like this feeling of like we know what's going on there, but it's like this. It's just like we don't have the access to the resources to really fully understand this culture as like a layman person sitting at the home, just watching TV or something like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, do we really, by and large understand it now, right?
Oh, yeah, true. There's that too.
There are a lot of misconceptions and sort of barriers to that understanding. But, I think you have to remember in the 80s, there was like Japan was in its bubble economy, right? Yeah. So it was very successful. It was doing, it was, I think from Western, perspective, it was seen as very technologically advanced, making a lot of cars, making a lot of electronics, a really, just economically kind of, sort of impressing the world and the West, with what they were doing. And I think that, but there was still kind of that mysterious, um, I don't know if you'd call it Orientalism or anything like that,
Yeah.
but you heard whispers about things in video game magazines and things like that, but you didn't really have the internet.
Yeah.
So, it wasn't such a small world, I guess, the
Yeah.
way that it is more now. So yeah, things were a little bit different. There definitely was a fan community around the pcfx. I think even back at that time, I believe Aaron Nanto's website, pcfx, or it wasn't pcfx, but it was like PC Engine FX World, something like that, I believe was around then.
Okay.
Because my buddy and I think, actually, checked that website to find out some information about some games, things like that. So there definitely was a small community of fans, in the West for the system. But it was definitely, it was a pretty niche thing. And I don't think there was a lot of information. There still isn't a lot of information about the pcfx, right? I think that's something you and I, would like to work on a little bit.
Yeah. And that website that you mentioned, sorry, I already blanked on the name of it, but I think I've been there before. And it's basically like a kind of repository of information of like, here's a games list for the pcfx. Here's like some, scans of manuals and things like that, if I recall correctly as well. I think this was like before Wikipedia was like a huge thing too. So like you didn't have like a easy to access pcfx Wikipedia page to go to and like just pull up a list of games and things like that. So like, I think probably a very super valuable asset at that time, at the very least.
Definitely. Yeah. It probably seems a little underwhelming now, but
yeah.
it was pretty useful. Like at the time.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure. So you had these fans at the time, right? But eventually, and maybe this was there from the start, you can probably let me know if it is otherwise, but eventually I would say the PCFX kind of got an image that kind of soured around it to some extent from Western fans, from I think a variety of reasons. One is, obviously the console was not super successful. It only has 60 games and things like that. But the types of games that are on it are things that, people who are even importing games probably weren't interested in checking out for the most part. These very, text-based heavy simulation games, RPGs that would, all be in Japanese. So unless you were sitting there with like, a Japanese dictionary trying to, translate it on your own as you're just sitting there, you probably didn't have access to a lot of, or it was probably a difficult process to get through one of those games. But it feels like at some point when I started learning about the PCFX later on the internet, it felt like it almost came with a built-in soured opinion. So do you remember like when that came about, of just like people thinking that this system, well, maybe I should say before we like what that soured opinion is, it's just this idea that like it's a terrible system that's like filled with shovelware and like text-based shovelware, so talking heads, visual novels and things like that. And then also there's the part of the game aspect of the system where it has like 18 plus games, so people will say it's a like basically a hentai only system kind of thing, that kind of thing. So it's like this very negative, degrading view of the system in a lot of ways, I think, by Western fans. So like, was that there from the start, from what you can remember, or is that something that built up over time, or is it there's a particular moment you can think of where that kind of came into play?
That's a great question, and I think it's hard because this may just be anecdotal for me, right?
Yeah.
Because I really knew nothing about the system until my buddy imported it, right? We were gamers, and we were just getting into anime at the time. So like unbeknownst to me, like one day he's just like, "Hey, I imported this video game system," and it's like, it's this Japanese system, like check it out. And we thought it was really cool. Granted, we couldn't play a lot of the games, right? Because we didn't know Japanese. But that didn't really, we didn't have like a negative opinion of the system itself, right? And it was just another thing that was happening. We were also playing games on the PlayStation and various other systems and just having fun. And I don't think there was this impression of like a lot of disappointment or negativity around the system. So it wasn't until much later. I mean, for me, I almost feel like it was more maybe watching things on YouTube for me that really helped me to understand that, there is and was a lot of disappointment around the system. Certainly, I think any system that is viewed as being like the last hurrah for a developer, like a company, right?
Mhm.
So like with Sega, the Dreamcast, I think, kind of becomes a martyr in a way, like the system itself. I feel like people really like the system, but I think people, don't like who was it, Molyneux or something, that was the head of Sega America at the
Bernie
time, who basically like
Sanders? Not
it,
Bernie, not Bernie Sanders. What's his name? Gosh, I know who you're talking about. Oh,
I swear it was Peter Molyneux, I think. Anyway, somebody, basically was just
Bernie Stoller.
discontinued. Oh, could be. I don't know.
Yeah, Bernie
Um,
Stoller is his name. So
discontinued the
yeah,
the system in the US anyway, right? So, and that leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and you feel like Sega, exited the hardware market, and you wonder how if things would have been better today if Sega were still making hardware, right?
yeah,
It's hard. It's a hard moment for fans. So I think that's one of the things with the PCFX is it was the last console that NEC, made with Hudson, and so I feel like there is a desire to point fingers and be
yeah,
like, what killed, NEC as a hardware developer for, for video game consoles, right? So, and I think that finger ends up getting pointed squarely, at the PCFX. And, I think in some ways, some of the accusations that get levied against it are a little unfair. So I'd kind of like to, as we continue this podcast, maybe explore a little bit more, like what are the truths behind that? Because maybe people are so wrong about some of the reasons, but maybe they are, and it's interesting to talk a little bit more about that. But I think that was definitely a big part of that.
yeah, yeah. And I think obviously there's that aspect of it for sure. But then there's kind of I feel like an elevated aspect of that of maybe like an over exaggeration about the system in a lot of ways too. So I mentioned earlier that people call it like a system only for hentai and things like that, right? But the reality is that the majority of the library doesn't have any kind of explicit content that would be any worse than I feel like most anime from the era. I mean, obviously there's different levels of anime out there for young adults, up from there, right? But there's definitely a level, like a tinge of sexuality to it. But like to me, it feels very around what I would expect from a lot of popular anime from that time. Maybe it leans depending on what you're looking at, and there's obviously different cultural shifts that are happening in general of just like sometimes underage characters show up and like how those are portrayed and things like that. And I feel like that even today, that's kind of still something that anime struggles with to some extent, right? Depending on how you view it and how you view it as a Westerner and all that stuff too, being outside of the culture itself. And then also just how you view it as a whole, I guess.
Yeah,
So, but the reality is that the majority of the games on this system are, you know, um, pretty much in line with what you would get on like a Sega Saturn and a PlayStation in terms of the type of content. If anything, I think the Saturn might have more adult content overall. It's just the libraries size are quite a bit different. I don't know what the final Saturn library size is, but it sure is like way bigger
it's
than
a lot
16.
more than the PCFX. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I think you end up with these really heavily exaggerated things that end up coming up. And I think you had mentioned to me before, and not to like put you on the spot about this, but you felt some guilt as I think you had mentioned at the start of the show. You did a fan translation a while ago for a game called Welcome to Pia Carrot, and it's one of the few fan translations out there in English, right?
Yep,
And that is a 18 plus game on the PCFX, and
it is.
it's one of the few things that an English player can play, right?
Yep.
And really, really enjoy. And so I think you mentioned to me before that you felt a little bit of guilt because it felt like you painted a picture of the system that you didn't really mean to paint by working on that project to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I don't regret translating that game at all because it's a game that I played on the system. I
Mhm.
really enjoyed. It's a really great game. And, I feel like it's given an opportunity for people to play that game and realize, that there's a lot to it and it actually is like a really good game. Yeah, but that said, I do regret a little bit that I feel like I probably contributed to uh perpetuating a stereotype about the system. And I think, part of the trouble as well is, I mean, I feel like we got to be a little bit scandalized that, ooh, the system has adult only games on it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the 3DO has them, like, other game systems have them, so it's not unique to the PCFX, but that got to be a thing. And I think with that being a thing, there's also a little bit of confusion, I think, when people look at the library of games on the system, because they are very they do come from a place of like a very strong anime aesthetic to the system, and to, like, not all of the games that are on the system, but a large portion of them. And there are a lot of what you would call gal games on the system. These are basically games that feature pretty girls um as like main characters, and as kind of like a selling point. I mean, I have behind me here, Ralphie, who was the mascot character of the PCFX itself, right? So there was very much this sort of like pretty anime girl aesthetic, that I think NEC was, um, was promoting with the system. And I think it's easy to confuse that with, oh, the game is full of, you know, like games essentially, or something
Yeah.
like that,
Yeah.
which is just not, it's kind of objectively untrue. And I think we've mentioned this before too. Like, there are, I think, 3 adults only games on the console. There are, I think, another 3 or so mature audience, games, like, similar to the mature rating that we would have now on games, which there are like hundreds and maybe thousands of on like the new consoles. So, I think it's pretty unfair to sort of like paint the PCFX with that broad brush, but I think it's easy when you see the number of gal games on the system, and don't, make an effort to separate those out, where it's like, hey, this is just an adventure game where a bunch of pretty girls, go and fight against what is it, a thief who's trying to steal artifacts, around the world, or something like that.
Yeah.
And you get that, basically conflated with, with something less, less on the up and up, I guess.
Yeah. And I think a big thing is that a lot of people in the English speaking community, I think, do not play through these games entirely. And so they often make assumptions about them without really sitting down and thinking about them, or they may just straight up not understand it, right? Like, there's the launch game on the system called Graduation 2. And like, if you don't know what you're doing, you're getting nothing out of that game. I put that in for 30 minutes and like, wow, I need to revisit this at some point later. But if you're going to put that in a YouTube video, you have to say something about it, right? Then, like, what are you going to say about it? Well, you are a teacher teaching 5 girls kind of thing, and they're pretty girls kind of thing. And there's like special graphics that are like highly detailed graphics of them and stuff. And I haven't looked at them all. I assume some of them probably lean to the sexual sense to some degree. I don't know for sure though. But like, some people, are going to just make that jump immediately rather than really trying to even figure out that's what it is actually. So a lot of times. So, but yeah, it's a system that I think in a lot of ways, the way people have talked about it have really built this narrative around the system. And as people have kind of regurgitated the story about the system over and over and over again, I think it's kind of further made it even more extreme to some extent. And so what happened, I think, as well, is you come to the YouTube era where you have people talking about the system as well, often people who don't really understand, what these game genre are that they're being referenced. A lot of these, we mentioned at the beginning, a lot of this was informed by Japanese only PC games a lot of the times. So like, people don't understand where they come from, and like what makes a good simulation game, what makes a good,
Adventure
game. Yeah. Or like what even a visual novel is, right? Like for until the last decade, visual novels were the butt of a joke, right? Like, they weren't really taken seriously.
Or even, I mean, like, even, like, why these were popular in Japan, and maybe, maybe that isn't even a kind of game that you're going to enjoy, right?
Yeah. And like, and part of this podcast is going to be kind of exploring some of these things and understanding the significance of some of these games to a better degree, at least for me personally. But like a lot of the games on this system, I think are fairly high profile Japanese releases that were very popular at the time, at least within the audiences who are interested. But, you had, Gal games becoming a more mainstream thing. I mean, like Tokimeki Memorial, that game is one of, I'd say, from the impression I get outside of Japan, one of the most important Super Nintendo games, at least from Konami, right? Or I don't know what system it started on, PC Engine probably actually, but
it was hugely influential.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, but like we didn't have that here, so like nobody had context for that until somebody makes a video, way later. And I actually don't even know like what the current Tokimeki Memorial video status is. I know there's that one video that's like 6 hours long, and I'm like, I'm not watching that, but I hope it's good. So yeah. But yeah, I think a lot of the commentary in this game has kind of all came from. I don't want to say 100% this, but I think a lot of people come into the system really expecting it to be not good, full motion video like games only. And
I mean, even that is so not true,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
There were a handful of games that I would kind of call full motion video games, but even most of those are actually like kind of action games, like they're like two versus fighters and things like that.
There's definitely a as kind of restricted as the pcfx is in terms of the types of genres they are. I mean, those games are very different games in a lot of ways. There are the more just like the adventure games. There are, like you mentioned, the fighting games that use full motion video. There's technically a real fighting, or if you want to call it real, in the modern sense, you'd call it like there's not really a FMV fighting genre anymore, right? That's been long gone at this point. But there is a more traditional fighting mini game kind of thing on one game. But like, just like there's a pretty diverse library of games. You mentioned earlier RPGs are a big part of the system. So, maybe not the Final Fantasies of the world are on the system, but some of these, more smaller scale, smaller scale in the West, RPGs are on that system. Although I'm trying to think if there's anything that was popular in the West at all that showed up on the PCFX game. Like,
no, I mean, that's also a really good point.
No.
Is like, because some of these games were ported to other systems like the Saturn and the PlayStation from the PCFX, right? But even the ones like that were like kind of maybe more popular on the PCFX, and then maybe actually got some traction, like actual traction on some of these more popular systems, are not franchises that are like ever were released in the West, right?
Yeah.
I think there's maybe one game which I am hoping that we talk about on the podcast, probably sooner rather than later, that is part of the like a RPG series that Western gamers would be familiar with, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to mention that, or should we just kind of?
I mean, it's Der Langrisser, I think is what it's called, right?
Yeah, the Langrisser series.
I know nothing about this series, I will say.
Yeah.
But...
Well, I mean, it's also a pretty niche series, like in the West, right? So it's not like we're talking about, I don't know, the Tales games or something like that, which everyone knows at this point. But Langrisser is at least something that some, hardcore gamers, RPG gamers and tactical RPG fans are going to be familiar with. And, the PCFX, Langrisser game is, it's a pretty important game, I think, in the Langrisser series. And it was pretty influential on the series as a whole.
So thankfully, me and you, Filler, we previously did a podcast. So I run another YouTube channel on it's more of a variety channel, and that's kind of where this podcast came out of in some degree, because I was tired of the PCFX getting shoved to the side all the time on my variety channel. But we did a podcast that really focused on kind of covering the total library of the system to some extent. We obviously don't talk in depth about every single video game, but I think we paint a good brush of like what is a good like view of what games are on the PCFX and what types of games they are and how accessible they are. Going down to like what types of RPGs are on there and things like that. So in the podcast feed for this, I'll include that as a additional episode. Essentially, it'll just be a repurposing that old episode. But if you want to know more about the software library as a whole, I think we do a good job in that podcast we previously did. And as we go forward with the series, I think we'll touch on these games, genre by genre, individual game by individual game sometimes. I think it's going to be kind of up in the air as we kind of go through different topics and things like that and how we want to approach them. But I think that's a good starting point. Just get a general idea of the types of games on the PCFX beyond, just looking at what I call the holy trinity that like every YouTuber covers of, the one shooting game, the one beat 'em up, and the one I forget what the other one is actually off the top of my head.
A single screen platform.
Yeah, Chip
puzzle
Kick.
platformer kind of a game.
Yeah.
Puzzle, but.
Yeah, so there's that one as well. So those are kind of the three big ones that people talk about because they're the most accessible games and the ones that we can appreciate the most as somebody who doesn't speak. Well, I don't speak Japanese. You have some level of understanding. I won't make any claims about how you feel about your Japanese. I know that's like a very weird thing to do, but
yeah, enough to play PCFX games, like even if they're just in Japanese and like get something out of them, right? Like actually understand, the bulk of the stories and that sort of thing.
So yeah, I guess like in talking about your Japanese levels, like let's talk a little bit about, ourselves. If you've come from the previous podcast we did, you might already know a bit about us, but we're going to assume you're fresh to us. So I figured we'd go ahead and just kind of do a quick little walkthrough introduction about ourselves and what our background is. So, you can kind of understand where we're coming from when we talk about this platform, because I think me and you probably come from very different places, although I think we kind of came together when it came to the PCFX and like what our interests are and lined up in a way. So
yeah, no, they merged like, very, very seamlessly, I think. But yeah, no, my experience is probably quite different. Cause like I said, I did, play the system back in the day when it was contemporary. So, that was an interesting experience. And I ended up picking up a PCFX when I was in Japan. I kind of forget it wasn't actually the first time I visited. I guess the second time I visited, I got a PCFX system. But for a number of years, I only had like one or two games for it, right? And I think like most Western owners of a PCFX, right? It just kind of sat on my shelf and didn't do anything for a long time.
Yeah.
After a number of years, I got the idea to collect a complete collection for the system. Somebody who I had worked with on a fan translation of a PC Engine game. I believe it was actually the Meizani Koku adventure game, I think, on the PC Engine, that David Shanoff and I worked on, released as an unofficial English language translation patch. He was talking with me about the PCFX a little bit, and he had a full PCFX collection. I thought that was so cool. So I ended up kind of starting to collect that. And so, my journey on YouTube started, I guess, 11, 12, 13 years ago now, something like that. That's been quite a while. In the retro gaming community and in the game collecting community, really. So, I have a handful of complete game collections, systems that have smaller libraries, the Atari 7800, the PCFX, the US Dreamcast, things like that. So I'm definitely a video game collector, but I studied Japanese for a couple of years in college. I studied Japanese in Japan for a couple of months. And it's something almost like the PCFX where it's like it sat on the shelf a little bit, for a while. But I ended up fan translating video games. And that's something that I've done for decades now, for about 20 years. And I've, released, I'd have to look, but like, dozens of, translation patches for various games that were never released in English, thanks to the efforts of, kind of hackers, programmers, people that can go in and reverse engineer the code in these games and squeeze English text in and rewrite text routines and do all that, stuff, make more room space in the ROMs to, redirect the script and things like that.
It's a big team effort, I'm finding out as I learn more about the fan translation community and how that works.
It is. It's a rare person who can do all of it on their own.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's pretty lonely. So it's nicer to, have a group. So yeah, that's something that's been really important to me. So I think, just in terms of coming at the PCFX and coming at this podcast and things like that, that's, something where I've had the opportunity to help people, especially in the English language sort of speaking community, to appreciate and have the ability to play games in English that they couldn't before. Is also partially where I'm coming at with the PCFX, is I'd like to, give people a little bit more of that Japanese perspective, maybe use my language skills to help, help people just understand a little bit more about the system. So, if people don't like the system, right, they can have a more informed opinion rather than coming from a place of ignorance, where I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of the sort of knee-jerk reactions around the system really, really come from.
One thing I did want to get a little bit more information from you about, about you personally, is just like, and you can either talk generally now, or back when you were first in the PCFX, like what place were you kind of coming from that? Like, how did you, like, what platforms were you playing on typically? Were there particular types of games? Were you playing every platform? Did you have one specific one, or?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, when I look back at my childhood, like I played games, right? I wasn't necessarily a gamer, right?
Gotcha.
And I feel like that is kind of a thing that's evolved over the years. And at some point I kind of became a gamer. Like it's something that I spend a lot of my free time doing. So I guess when we were getting into the PCFX, though, it was still more around the time of just playing games, right? So my buddy that imported the PCFX, he was like a buddy where I would go over to his house and we would play video games, right? That was like the way that we had fun.
Yeah.
So he was the one who had a Super Nintendo. I didn't have a Super Nintendo. He was the one who got a Jaguar. Okay. I got to play a bunch of Jaguar stuff with him. He was the one who got a PlayStation when it first came out, right? So we were playing things on that, like Kingsfield, right?
Yeah.
And what was it? Warcry, Warbird, or something. There was like some helicopter simulator, like Warhawk. That was it. Yeah. These some of these really, really early PlayStation, and they all looked horrible. Like the PlayStation was like,
they're trying.
The writing wasn't necessarily on the wall that this was like the next big thing, right? Because like those games were not necessarily great. But so that's the kind of stuff we were playing. And I mean, so me personally, like I had a Genesis and my folks got me a Sega CD. So I kind of feel like, maybe in terms of me warming up to the PCFX, my experience playing the Sega CD probably didn't hurt, right?
Yeah.
Because I played some FMV games, which I didn't hate. I didn't have like a negative opinion of them. I'm like, oh, like Sewer Shark, that was fun, right? I also got to see what was happening, especially with RPGs on the Sega CD. I played Lunar, and I really liked that. And that was really the RPG that got me. It didn't necessarily get me into RPGs, because I also really enjoyed like the original Final Fantasy on the Nintendo. I really enjoyed Might and Magic on the Genesis. I really enjoyed like the Dungeons and Dragons game on the Genesis. But it got me into JRPGs. And so it really primed me for things that were a little more character focused and had like anime aesthetics and things like that. So once my buddy imported the PCFX, I was really ready to like actually be excited about what I was seeing on that system.
And what is your favorite PCFX game that you've played?
I mean, I have to say, my favorite game has to be Welcome to pcfx, right? Again, I feel like that's not maybe the best ambassador game for the system. But I mean, in some ways, like you have to understand that, I've mentioned this before. I think people, when they think of a game that has adults only content in it, right?
Yeah.
Is something to be ridiculed, right?
Yeah.
It's something, it's not something that's going to be like a good, interesting gaming experience, right? Mm-hmm. And I think Welcome to pcfx is so interesting because like you could take the adult content out of that game and it's still a really kind of touching, um, sort of really personal um, game about relationships,
Yeah.
right? About romance, about growing up, just sort of like it's a story, right? And there are multiple endings to it. The game isn't terribly long. The first time you play, it's probably going to be about 3 hours. Subsequent playthroughs are probably going to be about 2 hours.
Yeah.
And there are different routes, as you have in these romantic adventure games, where you get to know a particular character. I think there are maybe 8 girls in that game, something like that. I could be wrong, maybe 7 or 8. And it's really wonderful. And I think what you see is when people actually put aside their preconceived notions, come at the game with an open mind and actually play it. There are several reviews on YouTube where people are like, "Oh wow, this was so much better
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be. It's so much of a better, interesting, valuable experience that no, I think it's so easy to just discount a game like that before you've tried it."
Yeah, I think the way I always kind of put it in kind of layman's terms for anyone who might not be into kind of the visual novel, romantic adventure kind of space, or be willing to touch like anything with that has 18 plus content in it, is it's more about like it's more like a TV show that has like erotic elements in it or like sexual elements in it, like to convey something about the characters. It's not a
Yes.
with a story kind of thing, right? Like I feel like there's
Right.
two different
Right.
sides of the spectrum there,
Yeah.
and that is there are games like that.
Mhm.
I a game that I actually really like. It's like a strip card game on the pcfx. It's actually
Yes. Yep.
surprisingly great in my
It's
opinion,
totally it's fun to play. Absolutely.
but that is just like, hey, they're just stripping down. That's just kind of it when it comes to like that part of it. Versus Welcome to Pia is a that is a part of the relationship building process of that story,
Yep.
kind of thing. So
Yeah.
yeah,
How many movies or TV shows or something have love scenes in them
yeah,
that are important to the story and the characters? Like
yeah.
that's much more what it's like.
And I think we would be it would be bad if we didn't mention Speedy Noel's video. Her channel is called Amelie Dory, and I'm sure I'll link it or whatever. She did a pretty deep dive on Welcome to Pia Carrot. I think the PCFX version specifically, right?
Yes.
And I have not watched that video because I have not played Welcome to Pia Carrot, so I'm like, I can't spoil myself yet. But I think you have given it glowing remarks in terms of the quality of it. So I'm sure we'll talk about Pia Carrot more in the future as well. But if you want to get a deep dive on that now, I think that's a great place to go for that.
It's
So
extremely well done. And, if you just look up Welcome to Pia Carrot PCFX on YouTube, like you will find that video.
yeah,
But yeah, we could put a link, or something too on the
yeah.
YouTube.
So for myself, I feel like in some ways I'm like kind of the least qualified person to talk about the PCFX to some degree, just because I feel like I come from a very weirdly normal background that just got really off the rails at some point. So I was like a really big Nintendo fan growing up. I played the normal stuff, on Super Nintendo, so Mario Worlds, Donkey Kong Countries. Whenever Nintendo 64, played, every big game there. Around that time, I got like a PlayStation as well. But Nintendo was like my big thing, and I kind of kept just going that path for a really long time. But then I got to the Wii and the DS era, and this like might not seem like it's super relevant, but I think in hindsight, it actually is something that's like really relevant to why I ended up with the PCFX. But I kind of fell in love with Nintendo's kind of approach at that time to trying new different things with hardware, and creating unique experiences based off that, and the hardware playing a big role in that. And I kind of love that about the DS and the Wii itself. But I kind of was running into the situation where like there are games that Nintendo was putting out that was definitely working with the Wii and the DS. But I felt like as time went on, less and less that was true. And I was kind of becoming somewhat unsatisfied by Nintendo's output specifically. There are definitely games that did that. But and so I ended up kind of going off the rails at some point and really just kind of exploring different types of games and trying to kind of, I guess, recapture that experience, even if it wasn't hardware specific, just games that are really unique. And one of the games I kind of went to initially, I mean, this isn't like a niche thing or anything like that, or I guess to some extent it's niche. Like Shenmue was like a big game I went back to, and just like the design of Shenmue as a video game when I was looking at this maybe like 2008 was like really different than where video games kind of went in a lot of ways. I think to some degree we've kind of came back to what Shenmue was to some extent. Um, but at the time, it just felt like it was just like a dead end development. All this effort was put into this thing that just didn't go anywhere. And I kind of fell in love with the design of Shenmue in a lot of ways. And then I kind of went from there, just trying to find more experiences that felt like that, like something that just feels wholly unique. Maybe not wholly unique, but really, really, it's a standalone thing that left a mark, but like it may not necessarily have informed all game design going forward, kind of thing. I think I like those experiences a lot because they feel a lot more unique than something that's being built upon nonstop over and over and over again. I actually have a really hard time going back to, some popular games like Super Mario Brothers 3 is a game I use as an example. Like, I just don't like playing Super Mario Brothers 3, but it's because I've played so many Mario games since then, and like, this is all just kind of Mario to me to some extent. So then around that time, though, I started getting into like importing games, and I imported some PlayStation games because I actually, through an interest in Dragon Ball Z as a kid, got into mod chipped stuff in my PlayStation so I could play Japanese Dragon Ball Z games. So I just happened to have this modded PS1 around. So I got into importing games, and one of the first games I imported was a fighting game called Blue Breaker Burst 2. And that game I kind of fell in love with because of the presentation. It had had a ton of characters. They're all like fully voice acted, and they had these really nice animations like in the scene. So, like in visual novels, you have talking heads a lot of times, and they'll kind of phase between different like stances and stuff and to like show emotion. But like in the case of Blue Breaker Burst, like these characters would animate between poses, which I thought was like super cool. And they're all hand drawn animated. It's not like today with live 2D where everything's kind of, manipulated. Nothing wrong with that. I have a fascination with live 2D on its own.
I wonder if some of those were actually taken from the Blue Breaker pcfx game.
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of where the story goes, is that I kind of played Blue Breaker Burst 2, I fell in love with it, and then looked into what is Blue Breaker. And it was like, oh, it's this PCFX RPG series that came out, or game. I guess there's only one game technically. There's a variety of ports, and then there's a series, 2 fighting games that are kind of more or less the same game, honestly. But yeah, and I just kind of fell in love with this one game, and that game I think held a lot of similar values of what the PCFX had, because these developers that worked on it, Hugh Next, were, for all intents and purposes, the first party developers of the PCFX, and they put out a ton of stuff. Well, ton of stuff, within the context of the PCFX. They worked on a lot of PCFX content. Their name is probably on at least 10 of those discs to some extent, right? Between the Anime Freaks discs and the individual games and things like that as well. And so, yeah, I kind of fell in love with that style, and then eventually kind of wrapped back around to me finding out about the system. And then I kind of sat on that for like a year, and then I ended up looking at Storefront. It's actually where I still buy all my PCFX stuff, which is Japan Retro Direct. And I bought Team Innocent, which is one of the launch games to the PCFX. And Team Innocent is something that's like kind of unique on the system, that it's like a kind of, to some extent, 3D survival game, but it's all with like represented in 2D graphics and stuff. It's very kind of Resident Evil-ish, and if you want to like put a post down with like one of the more popular franchises. And I really loved just like what that game was doing with the character animations in that game, just like these really super high quality characters animating, tons of voice acting, that just like these characters that were, even though I couldn't understand what they were saying, like were conveying the emotion of what was happening a lot of times. And there's so many visual aspects in PCFX games with animated cutscenes and these like high detailed graphics that I felt like I was really getting something out of the game in a way that I didn't necessarily feel like with some of the other import games I picked up, that were just kind of like, text on a screen, then played the video game. I felt like I was getting a part of that story that I really didn't feel like I was getting in previous games I've imported. So, and then from there, I think that's kind of the end of that. I really wanted to make a Team Innocent video for my YouTube channel, so I imported a PCFX because I was using an emulator at the time, and I was like, I'd rather play this on an actual console where I can capture this properly. And then I started making PCFX videos, and I think it's just kind of cascaded from there, of just like, I'm learning about all these video games, and I just think it's really fun. And all these video games feel really different than, what eventually became kind of the mainstream video game market in a lot of ways. Obviously, those games have their lives and histories afterwards, and other platforms have carried on the torch of what the PCFX did. But the PCFX as a whole, I feel like, is the most like um, boiled down version of what that is in a lot of ways, and it is just super super specific to that. So
Yeah, the PCFX, it actually was kind of a home for certain games, maybe even like certain developers, and just like a certain um, you know a moment in time. And yeah, no, it's interesting. Like that didn't really it didn't really become like the mainstream,
mhm.
but it's such an interesting sort of, I don't know, underground, like
Yeah,
side street in
yeah.
video gaming. Yeah.
So I more or less feel just like a weird displaced Nintendo fan to some extent, which is like not usually how you come to this console. I
That's
feel
a
like
that is very unique, actually. Yeah.
yeah. Like most, I think people come from the PC Engine space, Sega CD space. I I have an interest in the PC Engine as a PCFX fan, which I feel like is usually the opposite. But
Yeah.
I personally don't have a lot of vested interest in like what the led up to the PCFX, which I think was really helpful for me making sure when I came into the system that like I was looking at the system for what it was rather than like a set of expectations I had as somebody who was a PC Engine fan.
Sure, you had an open mind, and that's something I think we didn't really talk about, earlier. Is that, I think another way that the PCFX is, kind of primed to disappoint certain people
Mhm.
is, people coming from to the PCFX from the PC Engine, being kind of Western fans of PC Engine
Mhm.
games, because I feel like the Western, you know PC Engine gamer is, somebody who in particular is interested in like shoot 'em up games and action games and things that, like, there were some like really incredible games like that on the PC Engine, like full libraries
Yeah.
of a lot of really cool stuff. And the PCFX probably just seems like, completely alien to
Yeah.
somebody who recognizes the PC Engine as something that the PCFX is not. But it's interesting because the PCFX actually does come from, I think, some really firmly established aspects of the PC Engine CD and PC-98, but it's just not necessarily where the Western fan PC Engine is familiar with.
I guess to some extent, like one of the things of I think that is primed to make PCFX something that could be more better appreciated today is that I feel like we aren't operating solely from that PC Engine viewpoint now. We
Sure.
have people who have an understanding of what are what's good about visual novels. We mentioned Speedy Noel doing some great videos previously, but there is just a growing appreciation for these types of games that initially nobody in the West really had context for, so it's really hard to appreciate. So in the modern day, I think um, I don't think the PCFX is going to be a system that will ever be like the next big hit thing that, everybody's talking about when it comes to retro games. But I think we are on the cusp of the PCFX being a system that can be better appreciated as we have more and more people understanding the Japanese market, more and more people like you translating these games that give us the ideas behind these games, where they came from, and providing a better understanding for kind of the normal player in a lot of ways, or the normal retro game player that is it's, what is normal in the retro game player space if you're like doing fan translations, I guess, right? But it is different segments of the market. But I think we are at a position where there's a growing appreciation for these types of games, and so I think it's kind of time for the PCFX to have a moment to be relooked at, and people to kind of better understand what the system is and better appreciate what it is.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we're really planning on doing with this podcast is a few different things. One is trying to better understand like the environment of which the PCFX came out. Um, Anime is a big part of the PCFX. I will say you probably notice a distinct lack of anime in my background that I mentioned. I am not really a big anime fan. I like anime aesthetics, but like I don't watch anime very much. So part of this podcast I think is going to be kind of a journey, and thankfully you have a better understanding of that. And I think you were an anime fan at that time, right? Like,
I was.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
and have been since then, really.
yeah. So I think there's going to be a lot of us trying to exploring that space a little bit and understanding, who was involved with the system, because there was a lot of overlap, I think, with people in the anime industry, which I think to some extent is always true with Japanese games, to some level, but particularly the pcfx, with the fact that it has this very a lot of full motion video and stuff like that. There are companies that were involved in these systems that normally wouldn't have been, um, at least before this generation of consoles, right? PlayStation and Saturn also had full motion video and stuff like that, so it's not particularly unique to that. But there's people in the industry, I believe, that we've talked about in previous podcasts that kind of got started on the PCFX to some degree as well, and kind of eventually led into the anime industry from there. People in the anime industry who came to the PCFX, things like that. So I think that's going to be a big part of the show and what we're exploring, to that degree. I think we're also going to be talking about individual games themselves potentially too. I think it would probably be within the greater context generally. I don't think we're going to do too many episodes that are just going to be like, let's talk about how this one video game plays. But
Right.
I think
there are only 62
yeah.
games on the system, so but yeah, no, I mean, we both, I think I feel a little guilty having been involved with the system for quite a bit longer than you have. It compared to the amount of games that I've really played on the system, especially being that I understand Japanese to an extent. That so I think we both have definitely room to play more of the games and learn more about them. I think we were both excited about that, so that'll definitely be something we talk about.
Yeah, and I think one thing that maybe, if I wasn't clear from the start, I feel like this is going to be a journey for both me and you as well. We're not coming into this as the prime PCFX top-notch experts, we know everything kind of thing, right? We want to be looking into these things and trying to figure out these things a little bit more. Obviously, we have maybe a little more credentials than the majority of the audience out there, but I think it's going to be a learning journey for us as well in terms of
absolutely
through all that.
Yeah,
stuff.
the main thing that just the thought, the idea of doing this podcast has done for me is it's given me a lot more incentive to start, digging into information about the PCFX to learn more. Right. So, that I think is something that is going to be fun for us. And that's something that we can, hopefully pass on to other people. So, we can give you guys a better understanding, give an audience a better understanding of the PCFX as we, come to understand it better ourselves.
Yeah. So to talk a little bit about the, I guess semantics, is that the right word, behind how this podcast is going to be released going forward. So this is obviously episode 0. So it's kind of just the intro episode. This is kind of, we had to pack a good chunk of information about the PCFX at the start here. Going forward, basically what this podcast is going to be is basically a quarterly podcast. So we're looking at an episode every 3 months of the year about. We're going to try to hit that on the spot as much as we possibly can. But we're mostly doing this as a passion project, right? And so, life comes and goes, and we have our own, fillers doing fan translation work and things like that. But the thing that we also want to do with the podcast is talk to people who are actively engaged with PCFX in the English space. And so we really want to look at people who are out there doing PCFX stuff and try to bring them on the show and talk to them about what they're doing and, what that's going to be. I think, given the fact that the PCFX is such a niche console that we're going to have to keep that really broad. We're not going to be able to commit to here's the monthly hardware development section or something like that, right? That's probably going to be up and down of whether there's anything happening in that regard, right? But I think the big thing is just trying to find people who are relevant in this space, learn about what they're doing, learn about what they're engaging about. Also, as not probably having the biggest fan base in the world, just learning about what brought them to the PCFX in a lot of ways, right? What they like about PCFX, what are the priorities with it, and what drew them into the system, why they like it as an English speaker. As for most part, there might be some weird situations where we might have somebody who's Japanese give some feedback, but we'll see about that. I don't want to promise too much in that regard. So,
I mean, it's interesting. It just made me think that I believe that there is a non-insubstantial French fan base
yeah.
for the PC Engine or the pcfx specifically as well. So yeah, I hadn't even thought about trying to interact with French fans, but that could be interesting too, or just
If we can make that connection
where we're up
happen,
to.
we'll definitely make it happen. I think,
Yeah,
if we
yeah.
can. But yeah, so we have some people that we're going to be reaching out to ourselves. However, if you are someone who is involved in the PCFX and we don't know about, or we may know about you, but still reach out to us. I did set up an email address. It's Rolfie at pcfxfanclub.com. And so you can go ahead and email that. And even if you don't think you're doing anything important, I think we'd still be interested in hearing what you have to say. And maybe in the future we can do something with those comments and things like that. I know they're like Anime Freaks, the kind of like magazine discs that came out for the PCFX. They have like a user voice section or something. It's like maybe we could do a user voice section and include some brief comments. But I'll have the email address in the actual description for the podcast and things like that. So you can definitely check that out there. The other thing is that this podcast is being uploaded to YouTube as well. So we have an audio version of this podcast. You might be watching this on YouTube. And while I don't think either of us are committing to anything long term, we may also be uploading PCFX videos to this channel as well. I think we both have ideas of what we want to do with that. And we previously have made PCFX videos too. So I think going forward, we want to create a space where PCFX content can live and live on its own and be, one-stop shop for that kind of thing. So what we're really committing to at this point is doing 4 episodes a year. And then in between, we'll be doing interviews and videos, as it kind of works kind of thing. But one thing that we are trying to avoid doing is spending a lot of time on editing the podcast. We just think for both of us, our time would be better spent doing other things.
And really creating the content for the podcast and the channel.
Yeah, so we really want to focus on creating that content, and so we're going to try to basically outsource the editing of the show. That is going to cost money, so it's something that we'll be doing out of pocket here initially. But if you guys want to support the show, one of the things you can do is basically go to our Ko-fi page. We'll go ahead and put a link in the description for that. But we're also PCFX Fan Club on that platform as well. And you can do a donation to our efforts to hopefully support us. And then eventually, if we get past the editing fees and the costs of that per year, and we'll have information on that website if we have any like goals or anything like that will update with time and things like that. But eventually, we would also like to potentially use the donations for things like buying more materials that we can use on the show and then make available to you guys as well.
Especially sort of like primary source materials, right?
Mm-hmm.
Magazines, things like that we can translate, get additional information from, that kind of thing. I think like the research portion of this is super interesting, and just the fact that there's so much information that's kind of locked in Japanese language, around this system, because the system itself is kind of locked in Japanese language in Japan. Having the opportunity to actually get some of these things and learn more about the system via that is really exciting. And that's something that we might really appreciate some help with. That's a way that, folks could like really directly impact, what we're able to cover, and like maybe the new information that we can discover about the system itself.
Yeah. So definitely, if you can support us, we would definitely really appreciate it. And again, the link will be in the description for that. And there will be details on that page of what is available for you to donate with through there. So also a huge thanks to Cargadon, who did our unique Rolfie art for our podcast. If you look at all of our channels, it's the main imagery for that. She did a great job of modernizing Rolfie's design And hopefully, if we get enough money in the future, I kind of want to like commission more outfits for Rolfie, because Rolfie always puts on different outfits through all her pictures and things like that. So if you want more Rolfie outfits, let me know. I don't know if that's just my dream or not, but I would love to see more.
Dress up doll donation tier confirmed.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much for Carrigan for contributing that and helping us out in creating that imagery.
Yeah, she did a really great job.
We also have a Discord channel that we're going to be starting up. I think me and Filler have both found over the years that the pcfx community feels kind of broken up. There's a variety of forums. There's Discord channels within other Discord channels that exist for pcfx. And I think we really want to hope to bring all those people kind of to one place for that. And offer a space that we can have chats about the pcfx. Now, it's going to be a pretty straightforward channel. It's not going to be anything crazy in there. It's going to be, mostly a place for conversing. But that is kind of the main goal, is to kind of bring everybody in a place that we can kind of communicate with each other to some degree.
Yeah, and not any need to like replace any other like sort of pcfx discussions or communities or anything, because like I think between you and I, like we're pretty much members of most of those things, right?
Yeah.
And like have had discussions there and stuff too. So I don't think either of us are looking to like replace that, but maybe just provide like another place where where we can talk about the pcfx, because I think there aren't a lot of places to discuss it.
Yeah.
So it would be really nice if, people who are watching this and enjoying this and want to, learn more or be part of the discussion, a place where we can kind of hang out and talk about the system.
Yeah, and it's definitely one of those things that, like, it will also be a place that if you want to get updates about the show and things like that, that will be the place to do it. There's also going to be social channels listed in the description that will, at the very least, post whenever something new comes out for the channel. That
you interface directly with us,
and also interact with us directly as well in there too. So to wrap up today's episode, before we let you guys go, we wanted to do one last thing where basically we talk a little bit about what are we most excited for learning more about within doing this show and things like that. Personally, mine's maybe a little simple, but it's like something I've always, well, maybe not always, but in more recent years has been kind of the one thing I really wish I invested more time into at the PCFX, is I really want to learn more about a game called Megame Paradise 2. This is a really interesting kind of, I guess, would you say simulation is the genre for it? I don't know, adventure simulation.
It is absolutely a simulation. Yeah, I would say it's more sim than most of the simulation games on the system. It's very sim.
It's a very weird parody kind of game on the system. It like mentions the PCFX within the game itself. You can go into like a game store and buy various PCFX games in it too. But you're like these idols who walk around town and like basically are building a following and things like that. And maybe kind of rolling back to like my initial thing about like Shenmue really jumping out to me. It feels almost very like anime Shenmue-ish to me to some degree. And I've always been really excited. And like there's other things surrounding it too. Like this is the second game in the series, but the first game is like very different on the PC Engine. So like that's one thing that I've been kind of sitting there of like, I think this is like the most exciting space for me in the short term that I really want to explore on this system. So I hope we get to that at some point on the podcast. At 4 episodes a year, I'm not sure when we'll actually talk about it, but if I do play it, we'll give our updates, as we play through games, I think generally, and just give our general impressions as well during the different shows and things like that too. But that's probably what I'm most excited to learn more about is that. And I guess if you want to do something more general, I'm a huge Hunex fan, as I mentioned earlier, that first party PCFX developer. The more I can learn about Hunex, the happier I am. So how about you, Filler? What are you most excited for?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm most excited for really digging into a lot of the, the printed material around the PCFX. And, especially because it seemed like NEC was really into making these pamphlets, right? Mm-hmm. That you could, like, newsletters, essentially. So you had the like PCFX Anime Fan Club, it was called, right? Where There was a newsletter associated with that. You had things like NEC had a publication called PC Times, which I believe would basically just cover like their gaming stuff. So you've got the PC-98 and pcfx, whatever they were doing at the time, the PC Engine, I'm sure at one point. And just getting a chance to like have a few issues of this and start to dig into them. There are really interesting things that I've learned about, things I've reminded myself of, and things like that. So just the idea that there was a lot of, kind of direct communication from NEC themselves, communication around the pcfx specifically, and, just general, like, more gaming press stuff around the pcfx too. Personally, I'm getting more and more interested in, reading about that and really kind of, in a deeper way, digging into just what the narrative and the dialogue about the system was at the time. I think that's really cool. And yeah, I guess, personally too, like I'm interested in, just playing more games for the system. I think I mentioned, Pachinko FX. I actually took the time to learn how to play pachinko at one point, video game pachinko. And I'm really looking forward to playing that. And, the RPGs on the system and things like that. Really, the games library is tremendously interesting. So to have an excuse to really dig into that as well is something I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, and I think I've talked to you before about like to go back to your initial point of the media and what they're talking about at the time. Like I think a lot of time we don't think a lot about what games media thinks about video games when they're happening and things like that. So I think it's really exciting to do more of that, especially for a system like this that just really had very little impact outside Japan, kind of thing. Admittedly, it was a niche console there too, right? It's not like the pcfx was everywhere, but what people were saying about it in the few places that were saying things about it. So I'm really excited to hear about more of that too, as well, personally. So, and then more video game pachinko is something I've been meaning to learn at some point too. So anything I can learn along the way from you about that, because I will have to play that pachinko game at some point. My goal is to eventually play every PCFX game, as I think yours to some degree might be as well. So
sure. Yeah. Well, at some point here, I'm planning to make a how to play video game pachinko video. It has not materialized yet, but one of these days.
I'm looking forward to it. I need it because I don't know how to play video game pachinko at all. So anyways, thank you guys so much for joining us today for this episode 0 of the PCFX Fan Club. I really appreciate it. As I mentioned earlier, it is a quarterly podcast. So 3 months from now, we will be back with our first real episode. And so we'll have a topic that we'll be discussing there. We're also going to be looking at doing, we have a couple people we've talked about interviews with that will hopefully be able to show up at some point here in the near future as well. Potentially one before episode 1, actually, depending on when it comes out. But
and I just want to add, I think that is a really exciting interview. I think people should really be looking forward to it, in particular.
Yeah, for sure. If you do want to learn anything about or learn more about any of the things we talked about today, any links that we had mentioned or resources that we mentioned, those will be linked in the description. Same thing with, our Ko-fi page, as well as, the social media channels for this podcast, as well as the Discord channel, things like that. Everything we mentioned, we'll have a link in the description for, as well as that email address if you want to reach out to us. And hey, if you want to tell us about what you're most excited about learning about through the PCFX, that actually might not be a bad thing for us for topic purposes. Let us know if there's something that you're particularly interested in learning more about on the PCFX through Rolfie at pcfxfanclub.com. We'll get that email and then and take a look at it. So anyways, thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you again so much, Matt, for joining. We're co-hosts now, so thank you for being here. I will also thank you for being here too, I guess.
Yes. So, thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm excited about it.
Equally participating. Thank you was what we're getting today. So, but yeah, so we'll look forward to seeing you guys next time, and I hope you guys have a great beginning of 2023.